In the final years of his life, Robert Mitchum was no longer the young man who had stepped out of the shadows of film noir with sleepy eyes, a low, gravelly voice, and a careless charm that made Hollywood both admire him and fear him. Time had carved itself into his face. The dangerous calm that once made audiences believe nothing could touch him had become quieter, heavier, almost haunted. But the older he became, the more people began to look at him differently. He was not just a movie star anymore. He was a man who had lived through fame, temptation, scandal, silence, and myth. And behind all of it, there was one woman who remained deeper in his story than anyone else. She was not the loudest name in the gossip columns. She was not the most glamorous actress to stand beside him on screen. She was not the woman Hollywood whispered about the most. She came into Robert Mitchum's life before the world knew his name, before the studio lights turned him into a legend, before his cold, dangerous, masculine roles made millions believe he was the kind of man who could never truly belong to anyone. Her name was Dorothy Spence, and that is what makes this story unforgettable. Because in Hollywood, where love stories often lasted only as long as a film season, where promises could disappear after one red carpet appearance, the marriage between Robert Mitchum and Dorothy lasted almost his entire life. But this was not a simple fairy tale. Robert Mitchum was never an easy man to understand. He lived as though part of his soul always stood outside his own life, watching everything with a tired smile and distant eyes. He could make women fall for him simply by saying very little. He could frustrate directors with his careless attitude. He could send reporters chasing after him with stories about his private life. And he could make audiences believe that behind his cool expression, there was a secret no one could ever fully reach. Robert met Dorothy when they were both very young. At that time, he was nothing like a movie star. There were no mansions, no major contracts, no fame, no power. He was just a restless young man with a rough past, an unpredictable nature, and a future no one could guarantee. Dorothy did not enter his life because of the spotlight, because there was no spotlight yet. She loved a Robert Mitchum who had not yet been turned into a legend. A Robert who was raw, stubborn, unstable, and difficult. A man who could exhaust people around him, but somehow still made them unable to look away. That is why Dorothy's place in his life was different from every woman who came after her. When Hollywood finally began to open its doors to Robert Mitchum, his life changed quickly. From small roles, he rose into one of the most masculine and mysterious faces in American cinema. He did not look like a polished studio invention. He looked like a man who had walked dusty roads, slept in forgotten places, and learned not to trust good fortune for too long. That roughness made him dangerous on screen. It also made him a man the public always wanted to understand, but never completely could. As Robert became more famous, Dorothy chose a different kind of role. She did not fight for the spotlight. She did not make herself the center of Hollywood stories. She stayed behind the scenes, quieter and stronger. She gave him a home in a world where everything could collapse after a single rumor. She raised their children, protected the family, and carried the pressure that only the wife of a man like Robert Mitchum could truly understand. But the question that still lingers is this: how much did Dorothy have to endure in order to stay? Because Robert was not a peaceful man. His magnetism was too strong. He worked with some of the most beautiful actresses of his era. He lived in a world where the line between acting, emotion, temptation, and rumor was always dangerously thin. Stories about him were never ordinary. Sometimes they were about rebellion. Sometimes they were about scandal. Sometimes they involved women whose names were spoken with half-truths and quiet suggestion. And through it all, Dorothy remained. Not because she never felt pain. Not because their marriage was perfect. Perhaps the reason this story feels so powerful is that it was not perfect at all. It was the story of a woman who saw Robert Mitchum in moments the audience never saw. When he was no longer an icon. When he was no longer the coal man on screen. When he was simply a husband, a father, and a difficult man to live with, difficult to love, but impossible to replace. And perhaps Robert understood that too. Among all the eyes that looked at him with admiration, Dorothy was the one who had seen him before he became Robert Mitchum. Among all the praise for his masculine charm and careless style, Dorothy knew the weakness, the exhaustion, and the chaos behind it. Other women may have fallen in love with the image of Robert Mitchum, but Dorothy lived with the real man. That is why, when people ask who the woman Robert Mitchum truly loved was, the answer is not found in the brightest rumors. It is found in the woman who walked beside him when he had nothing, stayed near him when the world knew his name, and remained tied to his life until the very end. But to understand why Dorothy stayed for so long, we have to go back to the time before Robert Mitchum became a legend. Back to the days when he was only a rebellious young man carrying a darkness that Hollywood would later turn into gold. And it was from that darkness that his beautiful, painful love story truly began. Robert Mitchum's darkness did not begin in Hollywood. It began long before the cameras found him, long before directors realized that his tired eyes could say more than pages of dialogue. He was born into a world that did not give him much softness. His father died when Robert was still very young, and that absence left a silence that followed him for the rest of his life. Without a steady hand to guide him, he grew up rough, restless, and hard to control. He ran from rules. He drifted from place to place. He learned early that life did not always reward good behavior, and perhaps that is why he never seemed too interested in pretending to be good. Long before he became the man audiences watched in dark theaters, Robert Mitchum was a boy trying to survive his own hunger for escape. He traveled across the country, took odd jobs, got into trouble, and built the kind of inner armor that later made him look so effortless on screen. But that effortlessness was not really ease. It was defense. It was the face of someone who had already seen enough disappointment to stop being surprised by it. And then came Dorothy. She did not meet him as a polished gentleman. She did not meet him as a studio-manufactured dream. She met him when he was still unfinished, when his future looked uncertain, when the world had not yet decided whether Robert Mitchum would become anything at all. That matters because the love that begins before fame is a different kind of love. It is not dazzled by applause. It is not built on magazine covers. It sees the person before the world builds the myth around him. Dorothy saw Robert when he was still just Bob. That was the name close friends and family used, and in many ways, it was the name that belonged to Dorothy more than anyone else. Hollywood had Robert Mitchum. Moviegoers had the dangerous star with the slow voice and the heavy-lidded gaze. Directors had the actor who could walk into a scene and make it feel alive without seeming to try. But Dorothy had Bob, the complicated man behind the legend. The man who could be charming one moment and impossible the next. The man who could make people laugh, then disappear into silence. The man who wanted freedom, but still came home to the same woman. Their marriage began in 1940, before the storm of fame truly hit. At first, there was no guarantee that Robert would become one of the defining faces of American cinema. There were struggles, small roles, long days, and uncertainty. Dorothy was not living beside a finished success story. She was living beside a man with talent, danger, humor, and chaos all mixed together. She had to believe in him before believing in him became easy. And then Hollywood noticed him. Once Robert Mitchum entered the machinery of stardom, everything around him became louder. His face appeared on posters. His name moved through studios. His image became something people wanted to buy, sell, imitate, and possess. He played men who seemed morally bruised, men who carried secrets, men who could destroy or protect with the same calm expression. Audiences could not look away. Women, especially, were drawn to the sense that he was unreachable. There was something about him that made people feel they were seeing a man who did not need approval. But fame is never just applause. Fame enters a marriage like a third presence. It changes the air in the room. It brings admiration, temptation, suspicion, and distance. For Dorothy, loving Robert Mitchum meant sharing him with an entire world that believed it knew him. It meant hearing stories, reading headlines, watching women admire him, and living with the knowledge that her husband's public image was built partly on danger. That could not have been easy. Robert did not behave like a man desperate to protect a a perfect reputation. In fact, part of his appeal was that he seemed almost allergic to respectability. While other stars tried to appear polished and safe, Mitchum leaned into his rough edges. He gave interviews that sounded careless. He treated fame as if it were mildly annoying. He seemed to suggest that the whole business of celebrity was a joke, and he was the only one who knew the punchline. But Dorothy was not married to the joke. She was married to the cost of it. Behind the cool image was a family. Behind the rumors was a wife who had to decide, again and again, what was worth fighting for and what had to be endured. She was raising children while Robert traveled for films, moved through public attention, and carried the restless energy that had been with him since youth. Their home could not have been untouched by the pressures of his life. No marriage survives that long without scars, and theirs lasted long enough to collect many. Still, Dorothy remained the center of gravity. That does not mean the story was simple. It means it was stronger because it was not simple. She was not merely the patient wife waiting in the background of a movie star's life. She was the witness. She had seen the rise, the mistakes, the charm, the distance, the humor, the anger, the exhaustion, and the man behind all the performances. She knew what the audience only suspected. Robert Mitchum's mystery was not just an act. He really was difficult to reach. But Dorothy had reached him earlier than anyone else, before fame gave him more places to hide. And maybe that is why he could never fully leave her behind. Because every legend needs someone who remembers the human being underneath it. Every man who becomes a symbol needs someone who can still call him by his ordinary name. For Robert Mitchum, that person was Dorothy. She was not simply a chapter in his life. She was the thread running through the whole book. But as his fame grew, so did the shadows around him. And soon, the world would see Robert Mitchum fall into one of the scandals that could have destroyed another actor completely. For Dorothy, it would become one of the first true tests of what it meant to love a man everyone else was watching. The scandal came at the worst possible time, and perhaps that was what made it so dangerous. Robert Mitchum was no longer an unknown man struggling for a place in Hollywood. By the late 1940s, he had become something far more valuable and far more fragile. He was a rising star. His face was recognizable. His name had begun to carry weight. Studios could sell him as the man with sleepy eyes, a dangerous calm, and a kind of masculine mystery that audiences could not resist. But fame has a cruel habit. The higher it lifts a person, the more dramatic the fall looks when the ground disappears beneath him. When Robert was arrested in a highly publicized scandal, Hollywood did what Hollywood always does. It whispered first, then shouted. Suddenly, the man who had seemed untouchable was trapped inside headlines he could not control. Reporters circled the story. Fans wondered if his career was finished. Studio executives had to decide whether this rough, rebellious image was still profitable or whether it had become too risky to protect. For another actor, it might have been the end. For Robert Mitchum, strangely, it became part of the legend. But before the public could turn scandal into mythology, someone had to live through the private damage. That person was Dorothy. It is easy for audiences to talk about scandal as entertainment. A headline appears, a photograph is printed, a reputation is debated, and the public moves on to the next story. But inside a family, scandal does not disappear so quickly. It enters the house. It sits at the dinner table. It changes the way people look at one another. It creates questions no wife should have to answer in front of the world. Dorothy had married a difficult man, but now she was married to a difficult man under public judgment. And still, she stayed. That decision says more about their bond than any romantic speech ever could. Dorothy did not stand beside Robert because life with him was easy. She stood there because the story between them had begun before the world had an opinion. She knew the boy before the actor, the husband before the headline, the father before the scandal. To everyone else, Robert Mitchum was a symbol of rebellion. To Dorothy, he was a man whose flaws were not abstract, not glamorous, not printed in bold letters for effect. They were real. They had consequences, and yet they belonged to the man she had chosen years before fame arrived. This is where their love story becomes complicated. because love is simple when it is only about devotion. But Dorothy's love for Robert had to exist alongside embarrassment, pressure, rumors, and distance. She had to watch the world turn her husband's mistakes into entertainment. She had to hear people talk about him as though they knew him. She had to live with the fact that Robert's public image, the very thing that made him successful, was also the thing that made their private life harder. He was not sold to the world as a gentle family man. He was sold as danger. And danger has a cost. Hollywood loved Robert because he looked like a man who could walk through fire without flinching. But Dorothy knew that no one walks through fire forever without carrying burns. Behind that cool expression was a man who had spent much of his life avoiding vulnerability. He joked when others might apologize. He shrugged when others might explain. He hid behind casual remarks, behind charm, behind silence. The world mistook that for strength. Dorothy probably understood it was also armor. That may be why she became so important to him. She was not impressed by the armor. She had seen him before he learned how useful it could be. She had seen him when life was still uncertain, when money was not guaranteed, when his future could have gone in a dozen different directions. She knew that the man Hollywood called dangerous was also a man trying not to be fully seen. And in some quiet, painful way, Robert may have depended on that. He could perform indifference for the world, but he could not erase the woman who knew what existed before the performance. After the scandal, something unusual happened. Instead of destroying him, it deepened the public's fascination. Robert returned to work. His career continued. In fact, the roughness that might have ruined a more polished star only made him seem more authentic. Audiences looked at him and felt they were watching a man who had truly lived outside the rules. His reputation did not become clean, but became unforgettable. Yet Dorothy's role remained mostly unseen. She was not the headline. She was not the myth. She was not the smoky-eyed figure on the movie poster. But she was the person who absorbed the ordinary weight of an extraordinary life. Every time Robert survived a public storm, Dorothy had to survive the private one. Every time Hollywood turned his flaws into style, she had to live with the man behind them. And that is what makes her place in his story so powerful. The world loved Robert Mitchum for being impossible to tame. Dorothy loved him knowing exactly how hard it was to live with an untamed man. Other women may have been drawn to the danger. Dorothy endured the damage that came with it. Other women may have admired the mystery. Dorothy carried the reality behind it. But as the years passed, Robert's fame brought him into contact with some of the most beautiful and talented women in Hollywood. And soon, Dorothy would face a quieter kind of test, not one written in police reports or headlines, but one whispered through studios, dressing rooms, and the dangerous closeness of the movie set. Movie sets have a strange kind of intimacy. People who have never met before are suddenly asked to look into each other's eyes, whisper secrets, fight, forgive, embrace, and pretend that a lifetime of feeling exists between them. For most actors, the illusion ends when the director calls cut. But in Hollywood, especially in the Golden Age, illusion and reality often stood dangerously close together. And Robert Mitchum was the kind of man who made that line even harder to see. He was not loud in the usual way. He did not chase attention like some stars did. He did not need to. His silence did the work for him. When he entered a room, people felt him before he spoke. There was a heaviness around him, a kind of careless confidence that made women curious and men uncertain. He could stand beside the most glamorous actresses in the world and still look like the one person who was not trying to impress anyone. That was his power, and it was also part of the problem. For Dorothy, every new film meant a new world Robert entered without her. New locations, new hotel rooms, new late nights, new women who were beautiful, talented, lonely, ambitious, and often just as trapped by Hollywood as he was. The public saw romance on screen and wanted to believe something was happening off screen too. Sometimes the rumors were nonsense. Sometimes they were exaggerated. And sometimes, as with many stars of that era, the truth was probably more complicated than anyone outside the marriage could fully know. But Dorothy had to live in the space between truth and rumor. That may have been the cruelest part. A wife can confront a fact. She can argue with a fact. She can decide what to do with a fact. But rumor is different. Rumor floats. It follows a person without ever standing still long enough to be proven or dismissed. It turns every smile into evidence, every photograph into a question, every late return home into a shadow. And when the man at the center of it is Robert Mitchum, a man who often seemed unwilling to explain himself, the silence could feel heavier than any confession. Still, Dorothy remained. Not because she was weak. It is too easy to look at women who stay beside difficult men and call them passive. Dorothy's endurance was not the same as blindness. She had known Robert too long to be fooled by the surface. She understood that he was charming, reckless, evasive, and deeply resistant to being controlled. She also understood that beneath all that, there was a bond between them that fame could not easily replace. Robert may have belonged to Hollywood in public, but his history belonged to Dorothy. That history mattered. She had been there before the expensive suits, before the directors, before the admiration became a storm around him. She had seen the young man before the world turned him into a fantasy. That gave her a kind of authority no co-star, no admirer, no gossip columnist could take away. Other women could meet Robert Mitchum, the legend. Dorothy had known the man before the legend learned how to stand. And perhaps Robert knew that too. There is something revealing about a man who wanders emotionally but always returns to the same center. Robert's life was filled with movement. He traveled from set to set, role to role, city to city. His image was restless. His personality was restless. Even his screen presence felt like a man who might leave the room at any second and never explain where he was going. But Dorothy represented the opposite. She was continuity. She was the fixed point. She was the home he could resist, test, damage, and still need. That does not make the pain smaller. If anything, it makes it more tragic. Because loving someone like Robert Mitchum meant loving a man the world constantly pulled away. It meant knowing that his charisma did not turn off when he came home. It meant knowing that strangers felt entitled to dream about him, gossip about him, and claim pieces of him. Dorothy had to share her husband with an audience that wanted the dangerous man, not the ordinary one. They wanted the smoke, the mystery, the rebellion. She had to live with the ashes. And yet, the longer their marriage lasted, the more extraordinary it became. In a town where stars changed spouses as easily as studios changed contracts, Robert and Dorothy remained tied together. Not neatly, not perfectly, not without wounds, but tied together all the same. Their marriage became less like a Hollywood romance and more like an old scar, something that had been cut, healed, pulled open, and healed again until it became part of the body itself. That is why Dorothy's place in Robert's life cannot be measured only by romance. She was not simply the woman he married. She was the person who survived the full weight of him, the charm and the chaos, the fame and the fatigue, the scandals and the silences, the public image and the private man. But as the years moved on, Robert Mitchum's legend only grew darker and larger. He would play villains, drifters, soldiers, criminals, preachers, and broken men with such ease that audiences began to wonder where the performance ended and the real Robert began. And Dorothy, watching from the closest distance, may have been the only person who understood that the answer was never simple. Robert Mitchum's greatest trick was that he made acting look like not acting at all. He moved through films as though the camera had simply found him in the middle of a life he was already living. He did not seem to reach for emotion. He let it sit beneath the surface. A glance, a pause, a tired half-smile, and suddenly the audience believed they were watching a man with a past too heavy to explain. That was why directors used him so powerfully. He could play danger without raising his voice. He could play desire without seeming desperate. He could play evil without making it theatrical. In The Night of the Hunter, he became one of the most haunting figures in American film, a preacher whose calm voice made him more frightening than any scream could have been. And out of the past, he carried the weight of regret like a man who knew he had already lost before the story began. Again and again, Robert played men who were chased by darkness, and again and again. Audiences wondered if the darkness came from the character or from him. Dorothy must have watched that transformation with feelings no outsider could fully understand. To the public, Robert's darkness was art. To studios, it was value. To critics, it was screen presence. But Dorothy knew that some part of that shadow did not begin on a set. It came from a real man. A man who had wandered, suffered, rebelled, and learned to protect himself by pretending not to care. Hollywood did not invent Robert Mitchum's mystery. It only lit it properly. And that is where Dorothy's story becomes even more painful. Because she was not married to the legend. She was married to the source of it. She had to live beside the moods, the silences, the disappearances into himself. She had to understand when his charm was real and when it was a wall. She had to know when his jokes were jokes and when they were a way of avoiding something deeper. She had to see the exhaustion behind the fame, the loneliness behind the confidence, and the stubborn pride that made him difficult to comfort. There is a special loneliness in being closest to a man everyone else thinks they understand. Fans saw Robert Mitchum and believed they knew him. They saw the relaxed posture, the sleepy eyes, the cigarette, the casual voice, and they created a man in their imagination. Women admired him as dangerous. Men admired him as unbothered. Critics admired him as authentic. But Dorothy knew the truth was heavier. He was not unbothered because life had been easy. He often seemed unbothered because he had trained himself not to show where life had hurt him. That kind of man can be magnetic from a distance. Up close, he can be heartbreaking. And yet, Dorothy's presence in his life suggests that even Robert Mitchum, the man who seemed born to resist attachment, needed someone who could see through him without trying to turn him into someone else. That may have been the secret. Dorothy did not appear to spend her life trying to make Robert into a clean, polished Hollywood husband. She had known too much of him for that. She understood that taming him completely was impossible. But she also understood something more important. Beneath the rebellion, beneath the scandal, beneath the famous indifference, there was still a man who returned to the same woman, the same family, the same long, complicated bond. In Hollywood, that alone was rare. The industry around them was built on fantasy. Actors were taught to become desirable. Studios shaped faces, stories, marriages, and reputations. Everything could be edited. Everything could be promoted. Everything could be replaced. But Dorothy represented the part of Robert's life that could not be rewritten by a studio. She was not a role. She was not a publicity arrangement. She was not a beautiful chapter designed for the press. She was the woman who had been there before the script began, and that made her impossible to erase. As Robert aged, his screen persona changed, but it did not disappear. The young danger became older gravity. The rough charm became weathered wisdom. The man who once looked like he might break every rule now looked like he had already paid for most of them. He continued working, continued carrying that strange mixture of humor and melancholy, and continued to make audiences feel that there was always something unsaid behind his eyes. But outside the screen, time was doing what fame could not stop. The parties faded. The old studio world changed. The faces around him grew older. The gossip that once felt urgent became part of history. Younger stars arrived, bringing new scandals, new romances, new myths. Yet Dorothy remained beside Robert, not as an ornament from his past, but as the person who had survived the entire journey with him. By then, their marriage was no longer just a marriage. It had become a record of endurance. That endurance did not mean there had been no wounds. It meant the wounds had not ended the story. And perhaps that is why, near the end of his life, the idea of Robert Mitchum's true love becomes less about one perfect confession and more about one undeniable fact. When everything else moved, Dorothy stayed. When fame changed him, she knew who he had been. When the world turned him into a symbol, she remembered the man. When rumors came and went, she remained the name tied to his home, his children, and his final years. The tragedy is that people often realize the meaning of such a love only when the ending is near. Because by then, the noise is quieted. The scandals have lost their shine. The beautiful co-stars have become memories. The headlines have yellowed. And all that remains is the person who was there when the applause stopped. For Robert Mitchum, that person was Dorothy. But the final chapter of their story would not be about glamour, scandal, or Hollywood mystery. It would be about age, illness, memory, and the quiet truth that catches up with every man, even one who spent a lifetime acting as though nothing could touch him. In the final years of Robert Mitchum's life, the man who had once seemed larger than Hollywood began to look painfully human. For decades, audiences had watched him as if he belonged to another kind of world. He was the man who could stare down danger without blinking. The man who could make a threat sound almost gentle. The man whose face seemed built for shadows, smoke, and late-night confessions. But age has a way of stripping every legend down to the truth. The body slows. The voice softens. The eyes that once looked dangerous begin to look tired. And suddenly, the myth is not enough to protect the man inside it. Robert had spent much of his life acting as if nothing could hurt him. That was part of his appeal. He wore indifference like a coat. If scandal came, he shrugged. If critics praised him, he looked amused. If people tried to understand him, he gave them a joke, a silence, or a sideways answer that left them more confused than before. He made mystery look effortless. But near the end, even Robert Mitchum could not joke his way past time. The old Hollywood he had known was fading. The studio system that helped build him had changed. Many of the stars who once shared his world were gone or aging. The smoky rooms, the hard men, the dangerous women, the black and white shadows of film noir had become history. Robert was no longer the rising rebel. He was a survivor from another era, a man who had outlived many of the people who once stood beside him. And through all of that, Dorothy was still there. That is the detail that gives the ending its emotional weight. Not because their life together had been perfect, but because it had lasted. In a world obsessed with youth, beauty, and fresh desire, Dorothy represented something Hollywood rarely knew how to celebrate. She represented endurance. She represented memory. She represented the kind of love that does not always look dramatic from the outside, because most of its drama has been survived in private. By then, Dorothy was not simply the young girl who had once fallen in love with a restless boy named Bob. She was the keeper of a lifetime. She had watched him become famous, watched him become scandalous, watched him become admired, feared, misunderstood, desired, and mythologized. She had seen people applaud him for the same qualities that may have made him difficult at home. She had heard the world turn his flaws into charm, his silence into style, his recklessness into legend. But Dorothy knew what those things cost. She knew the man who came home after the applause. She knew the fatigue behind the charm. She knew the stubbornness, the distance, the moods, and the quiet moments when Robert Mitchum was not performing for anyone. She knew the ordinary human weight of a man the world insisted on turning into an icon. That is why, when people speak of the woman Robert Mitchum truly loved, the answer cannot be found only in romance. It has to be found in history. Love, in their story, was not a single perfect moment. It was not one dramatic speech before the curtain fell. It was not the fantasy of a flawless marriage untouched by temptation, anger, or regret. It was something more complicated and more believable. It was a woman staying close enough to know the truth. It was a man who could wander through fame, danger, and rumor, yet remain tied to the person who knew him before the world invented him. And perhaps that was Dorothy's power. She did not need to compete with the legend, because she had known the man before the legend existed. She did not need to defeat every rumor, because she had lived through realities deeper than gossip. She did not need to become Hollywood's idea of a great love, because she had already done something far more difficult. She had remained part of Robert Mitchum's real life. As his health declined, the image of the untouchable man became harder to maintain. The rebel who once looked as if he could survive anything was now facing the one thing no actor can outplay. The final act had arrived, not with dramatic lighting or a perfect line of dialogue, but with the quiet cruelty of age and illness. And in that final act, the question was no longer who admired Robert Mitchum, who desired him, or who whispered about him. The question was who had truly stayed. The answer was Dorothy. She had been there before the fame, through the fame, after the loudest scandals had passed, and into the years when the world began remembering Robert not as a current star, but as a living monument to a vanished Hollywood. She was the constant in a life built on movement. The private truth behind the public myth. The woman who had seen everything and still remained connected to the man beneath it all. And when Robert Mitchum's story finally reached its end, that was what made it so haunting. Not that he had been a perfect husband, not that their love had been untouched by pain, but that after all the glamour, all the rumors, all the women, all the roles, and all the darkness, the woman most deeply written into his life was still the one who had been there from the beginning. When Robert Mitchum died, the world lost one of the last great shadows of old Hollywood. The headlines remembered the actor first. They remembered the films, the voice, the face, the cool danger that had made him unforgettable. They remembered the man who seemed to drift through cinema with a cigarette in one hand and a secret buried somewhere behind his eyes. They remembered the scandal, the rebellion, the interviews, the roles that made him look less like a performer and more like a warning. To the public, Robert Mitchum belonged to the screen. He belonged to film noir, to westerns, to war dramas, to the long history of American movie masculinity. But Dorothy lost something different. She lost Bob. That difference is the heart of the story. The world mourned Robert Mitchum, the legend. Dorothy mourned the boy she had known before the legend existed. The young man who had not yet been dressed by Hollywood, framed by cameras, or turned into a fantasy for strangers. She had known him before the posters, before the famous eyes, before critics found words for his strange stillness. She had known him in the unfinished years, when life was uncertain and love was not protected by success. That kind of loss is almost impossible for outsiders to understand. For fans, a star can remain young forever. Every time an old film plays, Robert Mitchum returns exactly as he was. The voice is still there. The face is still there. The dangerous calm is untouched by age. But for Dorothy, memory was not so simple. Her Robert was not frozen in one perfect frame. He was a lifetime of changing faces. The restless boy, the young husband, the rising actor, the scandalous star, the distant traveler, the difficult man, the aging survivor, the husband who had come home so many times that coming home itself became part of their love story. And perhaps that is why their marriage remained so haunting. It was not the kind of love story Hollywood usually sells. It was not bright, easy, or clean. It was not built for soft music and perfect endings. It carried too much reality for that. There were pressures. There were rumors. There were public storms and private silences. There were years when Dorothy must have wondered how much one woman could hold. And there were probably moments when Robert, for all his indifference, understood that he had asked more from her than most people would ever see. But she stayed long enough to become the one person no legend could replace. That is what makes Dorothy's role so powerful. She was not simply the woman beside a famous man. She was the witness to the entire arc of his life. She saw him before fame lifted him, while fame tested him, and after fame began to fade into history. She saw the charm that made people adore him and the damage that charm could leave behind. She saw the mystery that audiences romanticized and the loneliness that may have lived beneath it. She saw the man when the world was watching, and she saw him when no one was watching at all. In the end, that may be the deepest form of love. Not the love that sees only beauty. Not the love that survives because nothing goes wrong. But the love that has seen enough truth to leave and somehow still remains connected. Robert Mitchum spent his life making people believe he could not be reached. That was the image. That was the spell. He seemed untouchable, unreachable, almost careless toward the very world that adored him. But Dorothy's presence proves that there was always at least one door in the wall. Maybe it was not always open. Maybe it was not easy to pass through. Maybe Robert himself did not always know how to stand on the other side of it. But it was there, and Dorothy had found it before anyone else. After his death, the stories continued. Critics kept writing about his films. Fans kept debating his greatest roles. Hollywood kept using his name as shorthand for a kind of masculinity that no longer exists in quite the same way. But beneath all of that, the quieter story remained. The story of a woman who had lived through the legend from the inside. The story of a marriage that was not perfect, but impossible to dismiss. The story of a man who may have been admired by many, desired by many, and misunderstood by nearly everyone, yet remained tied to one woman across more than half a century. So when people ask who Robert Mitchum truly loved, the answer does not need to be shouted. It is found in the beginning and the ending. Dorothy was there before the world wanted him. She was there when the world claimed him. And she was still there when the world had to let him go. That is why her name matters. Because after all the smoke, all the shadows, all the scandals, and all the myths, Robert Mitchum's most enduring love story was not with Hollywood. It was with the woman who knew him before Hollywood ever had a chance.